The extant manuscripts of the writings of the 1st-century Romano-Jewish historian Flavius Josephus include references to Jesus and the origins of Christianity.Josephus Antiquities of the Jews, written around 93-94 AD, includes 2 references to the biblical Jesus Christ in books 18 and 20 and a reference to John the Baptist in book 18. Scholarly opinion varies on the total or partial authenticity of the reference in Book 18, Chapter 3 of the Antiquities, a passage that states that Jesus the Messiah was a wise teacher who was crucified by Pilate, usually called the Testimonium Flavianum. The general scholarly view is that while the Testimonium Flavianum is most likely not authentic in its entirety, it is broadly agreed upon that it originally consisted of an authentic nucleus which was then subject to Christian expansion, alteration. Although the exact nature and extent of the Christian redaction remains unclear, there is broad consensus as to what the original text of the Testimonium by Josephus would have looked like. Modern scholarship has largely acknowledged the authenticity of the reference in Book 20, Chapter 9, one of the Antiquities, to the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and considers it as having the highest level of authenticity among the references of Josephus to Christianity. Almost all modern scholars consider the reference in Book 18, Chapter 5, 2 of the Antiquities to the imprisonment and death of John the Baptist also to be authentic and not a Christian interpolation. The references found in Antiquities have no parallel texts in the other work by Josephus, such as the Jewish War, written 20 years earlier, but some scholars have provided explanations for their absence. A number of variations exist between the statements by Josephus regarding the deaths of James and John the Baptist and the New Testament accounts. Scholars generally view these variations as indications that the Josephus passages are not interpolations, for a Christian interpolator would have made them correspond to the New Testament accounts, not differ from them. The 3 passages, James the brother of Jesus in the Antiquities of the Jews. Josephus refers to the stoning of James the brother of Jesus by order of Ananus ben Ananus, a Herodian-era high priest. The James referred to in this passage is most likely the James to whom the Epistle of James has been attributed. The translations of Josephus's writing into other languages have at times included passages that are not found in the Greek texts, raising the possibility of interpolation. But this passage on James is found in all manuscripts, including the Greek texts. The context of the passage is the period following the death of Porcius Festus, and the journey to Alexandria by Lucius Albinus, the new Roman procurator of Judea, who held the position from 62 AD to 64 AD. Because Albinus's journey to Alexandria had to have concluded no later than the summer of 62 AD, the date of James' death can be assigned with some certainty to around that year. The 2nd-century chronicler Josephus also left an account of the death of James, and while the details he provides diverge from those of Josephus, the 2 accounts share similar elements, representing the contrary view. Richard Carrier argues that the words "the one called Christ" likely resulted from the accidental insertion of a marginal note added by some unknown reader. Carrier proposes that the original text referred to a brother named James of the high priest Jesus ben Damnius mentioned in the same narrative. James is executed by Ananus. The Jews get angry at this. Complaints and demands are made. The king removes Ananus from being high priest. Jesus ben Damnius is then made high priest. Modern scholarship has almost universally acknowledged the authenticity of the reference to the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and has rejected its being the result of later Christian interpolation. Moreover, in comparison with Josephus's account of James' death, most scholars consider Josephus to be the more historically reliable. However, a few scholars question the authenticity of the reference based on various arguments, but primarily based on the observation that various details in the Jewish war differ from it. John the Baptist in the Antiquities of the Jews. Josephus refers to the imprisonment and death of John the Baptist by order of Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee and Perea. The context of this reference is the 36 AD defeat of Herod Antipas in his conflict with the Aretas IV of Nabatea, which the Jews of the time attributed to misfortune brought about by Herod's unjust execution of John. Almost all modern scholars consider this passage to be authentic in its entirety, although a small number of authors have questioned it, because the death of John also appears prominently in the Christian Gospels. This passage is considered an important connection between the events Josephus recorded, the chronology of the Gospels, and the dates for the ministry of Jesus. A few scholars have questioned the passage, contending that the absence of Christian tampering or interpolation does not itself prove authenticity. While this passage is the only reference to John the Baptist outside the New Testament, it is widely seen by most scholars as confirming the historicity of the baptisms that John performed. While both the Gospels and Josephus refer to Herod Antipas killing John the Baptist, they differ on the details and the motive. The Gospels present this as a consequence of the marriage of Herod Antipas and Herodias in defiance of Jewish law. Josephus refers to it as a preemptive measure by Herod to quell a possible uprising, while Josephus identifies the location of the imprisonment of John as Machaerus, southeast of the mouth of the Jordan River. The Gospels mention no location for the place where John was imprisoned. According to other historical accounts, Machaerus was rebuilt by Herod the Great around 30 BC and then passed to Herod Antipas. The 36 AD date of the conflict with Aretas IV is consistent with the approximate date of the marriage of Herod Antipas and Herodias estimated by other historical methods. Testimonium Flavianum. The Testimonium Flavianum is the name given to the passage found in Book 18, Chapter 3 of the Antiquities, in which Josephus describes the condemnation and crucifixion of Jesus at the hands of the Roman authorities. The Testimonium is likely the most discussed passage in Josephus. The earliest secure reference to this passage is found in the writings of the 4th century Christian apologist and historian Eusebius, who used Josephus's works extensively as a source for his own Historia Ecclesiastica. Writing no later than 324, Eusebius quotes the passage in essentially the same form as that preserved in extant manuscripts. It has therefore been suggested that part or all of the passage may have been Eusebius's own invention, in order to provide an outside Jewish authority for the life of Christ. Some argue that the wording in the Testimonium differs from Josephus's usual writing style and that as a Jew, he would not have used a word like Messiah. For attempts to explain the lack of earlier references, see Arguments for Authenticity. Of the three passages found in Josephus's Antiquities, this passage, if authentic, would offer the most direct support for the crucifixion of Jesus. The general scholarly view is that while the Testimonium Flavianum is most likely not authentic in its entirety, it originally consisted of an authentic nucleus with a reference to the execution of Jesus by Pilate, which was then subject to interpolation. James Dunn states that that there is broad consensus among scholars regarding the nature of an authentic reference to Jesus in the Testimonium and what the passage would look like without the interpolations. Among other things, the authenticity of this passage would help make sense of the later reference in Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews, Book 20, Chapter 9, 1, where Josephus refers to the stoning of James, the brother of Jesus. A number of scholars argue that the reference to Jesus in this later passage as the aforementioned Christ relates to the earlier reference in the Testimonium. Arguments challenging the authenticity of the three passages. The James passage. A comparative argument made against the authenticity of the James passage by scholars such as Tesarajik is that the passage has a negative tone regarding the high priest Ananias, presenting him as impulsive, while in the Jewish Wars Josephus presents a positive view of Ananias and portrays him as prudent. A textual argument against the authenticity of the James passage is that the use of the term Christos seems unusual for Josephus. An argument based on the flow of the text in the document is that given that the mention of Jesus appears in the Antiquities before that of the John the Baptist, a Christian interpolator may have inserted it to place Jesus in the text before John. A further argument against the authenticity of the James passage is that it would have read well even without a reference to Jesus. New Testament scholar Robert M. Price speculates that Josephus may have considered James a fraternal brother rather than a sibling. Some of the arguments for and against the authenticity of the James passage revolve around the similarities and differences between the accounts of Josephus, Origen, Eusebius and the Christian accounts. Although Josephus's account of the method of death of James differs from that of the Christian tradition, this is seen as an indication that the Josephus account is not a Christian interpolation. John Painter states that Origen expressed surprise that given that Josephus, who disbelieves in Jesus as Christ, should write respectfully of James, his brother. However, according to Painter, unlike the Testimonium, this issue has not generated a great deal of controversy, although viewed as a potential reason for doubting authenticity. An issue that is subject to more debate is that in commentary on Matthew, Origen cites Josephus as stating the death of James had brought a wrath upon those who had killed him, and that his death was the cause of the destruction of Jerusalem. At the end of Book 2, Chapter 13, Origen disagrees with Josephus's placement of blame for the destruction of Jerusalem on the death of James, and states that it was due to the death of Jesus, not James. In Book 2, Chapter 23.20 of his Church History, Eusebius mentions Josephus's reference to the death of James and the sufferings that befell those who killed him. In this reference Eusebius writes, "These things happened to the Jews to avenge James the just, who was a brother of Jesus, that is called the Christ, for the Jews slew him, although he was a most just man." Quote, however, this statement does not appear in the extant manuscripts of Josephus. Moreover, in Book 3, ch. 11 of his Church History, Eusebius states that the conquest of Jerusalem immediately followed the martyrdom of James, setting the martyrdom at c. 70 CE, rather than the c. 62 CE given by Josephus. Painter states that whether the Book 2, Chapter 23.20 statement by Eusebius is an interpolation remains an open question. Eusebius does not acknowledge Origen as one of his sources for the reference to James in Josephus. However, John Painter states that placing the blame from the siege of Jerusalem on the death of James is perhaps an early Christian invention that predates both Origen and Eusebius, and that it likely existed in the traditions to which they were both exposed. Painter states that it is likely that Eusebius may have obtained his explanation of the siege of Jerusalem from Origen. G.A. Wells has stated that the fact that Origen seems to have read something different about the death of James in Josephus than what there is now, suggests some tampering with the James passage seen by Origen. Wells suggests that the interpolation seen by Origen may not have survived in the extant Josephus manuscripts, but that it opens the possibility that there may have been other interpolations in Josephus's writings. Wells further states that differences between the Josephus account and those of Hegesippus and Clement of Alexandria may point to interpolations in the James passage. John the Baptist. Scholars such as Claudius Etzer have noted the differences between the rationale for the death of John the Baptist presented by Josephus, and the theological variations and the New Testament accounts. However, these differences are usually seen as indications of the lack of tampering, given that an interpolator would have made the accounts similar. Claire Rothschild has stated that the absence of Christian interpolations in the Josephus passage on John the Baptist cannot by itself be used as an argument for its authenticity, but is merely an indication of the lack of tampering. Testimonium Flavianum. The Testimonium has been the subject of a great deal of research and debate among scholars, being one of the most discussed passages among all antiquities. Louis Feldman has stated that in the period from 1937 to 1980 at least 87 articles had appeared on the topic, the overwhelming majority of which questioned the total or partial authenticity of the Testimonium. While early scholars considered the Testimonium to be a total forgery, the majority of modern scholars consider it partially authentic, despite some clear Christian interpolations in the text. The arguments surrounding the authenticity of the Testimonium fall into two categories: internal arguments that rely on textual analysis and compare the passage with the rest of Josephus's work, and external arguments that consider the wider cultural and historical context. Some of the external arguments are arguments from silence that question the authenticity of the entire passage, not for what it says, but due to lack of references to it among other ancient sources. The external analyses of the Testimonium have even used computer-based methods, e.g., the matching of the text of the Testimonium with the Gospel of Luke performed by Gary Goldberg in 1995. Goldberg found some partial matches between the Testimonium and Luke chapter 24 verses 19 to 21, 26, 27, stating the Emmaus narrative more closely resembles the Testimonium in its phrase-by-phrase outline of content and order than any other known text of comparable age. Goldberg's analyses suggested three possibilities: 1. That the matches were random, or that the Testimonium was a Christian interpolation based on Luke, and finally that both the Testimonium and Luke were based on the same sources. Internal arguments. One of the key internal arguments against the total authenticity of the Testimonium is that the clear inclusion of Christian phraseology strongly indicates the presence of some interpolations. For instance, the phrases, "If it be lawful to call him a man," suggests that Jesus was more than human and is likely a Christian interpolation. Some scholars have attempted to reconstruct the original Testimonium, but others contend that attempts to discriminate the passage into Josephan and non-Josephan elements are inherently circular. Andreas Kostenberger states that the fact that the 10th century Arabic version of the Testimonium lacks distinct Christian terminology while sharing the essential elements of the passage indicates that the Greek Testimonium has been subject to interpolation. Another example of the textual arguments against the Testimonium is that it uses the Greek term poids to mean do, but elsewhere in his works, Josephus only uses the term poids to mean poet, whereas this use of poids seems consistent with the Greek of Eusebius. The concordance use of the language used in the Testimonium, its flow within the text and its length have formed components of the internal arguments against its authenticity, e.g., that the brief and compact character of the Testimonium stands in marked contrast to Josephus's more extensive accounts presented elsewhere in his works. For example, Josephus's description of the death of John the Baptist includes consideration of his virtues, the theology associated with his baptismal practices, his oratorical skills, his influence, the circumstances of his death, and the belief that the destruction of Herod's army was a divine punishment for Herod's slaughter of John. G.A. Wells has argued against the authenticity of the Testimonium, stating that the passage is noticeably shorter and more cursory than such notices generally used by Josephus in the Antiquities, and that had it been authentic, it would have included more details and a longer introduction. A further internal argument against the Testimonium's authenticity is the context of the passage in the Antiquities of the Jews. Some scholars argue that the passage is an intrusion into the progression of Josephus's text at the point in which it appears in the Antiquities and breaks the thread of the narrative. External arguments. Origen's statement in his commentary on Matthew that Josephus did not accept Jesus as Christ is usually seen as a confirmation of the generally accepted fact that Josephus did not believe Jesus to be the Messiah. This forms a key external argument against the total authenticity of the Testimonium in that Josephus, as a Jew, would not have claimed Jesus as the Messiah, and the reference to "he was Christ" in the Testimonium must be a Christian interpolation. Based on this observation alone, Paul L. Mayer calls the case for the total authenticity of the Testimonium hopeless. Almost all modern scholars reject the total authenticity of the Testimonium, while the majority of scholars still hold that it includes an authentic kernel. A different set of external arguments against the authenticity of the Testimonium are arguments from silence, e.g., that although 12 Christian authors refer to Josephus before Eusebius in 324 AD, none mentions the Testimonium. Given earlier debates by Christian authors about the existence of Jesus, e.g., in Justin Martyr's 2nd century dialogue with Trypho, it would have been expected that the passage from Josephus would have been used as a component of the arguments. Even after Eusebius's 324 AD reference, it is not until Jerome's De Viris Illustribus that the passage from Josephus is referenced again, even though the Testimonium's reference to Jesus would seem appropriate in the works of many intervening patristic authors. Scholars also point to the silence of Photios as late as the 9th century, and the fact that he does not mention the Testimonium at all in his broad review of Josephus. A separate argument from silence against the total or partial authenticity of the Testimonium is that a 5th or 6th century table of contents of Josephus makes no mention of it. A final argument from silence relates to Josephus's own writings and questions the authenticity of Testimonium based on the fact that it has no parallel in the Jewish war, which includes a discussion of Pontius Pilate at about the same level of detail. In the witness to the historicity of Jesus, Arthur Dros stated that in the 16th century Vossius had a manuscript of the text of Josephus in which there was not a word about Jesus. Timing of the interpolations. Kenneth Olson has argued that the entire Testimonium must have been forged by Eusebius himself, basing his argument on textual similarities between the Testimonium and Eusebius's writings in the demonstrations of the Gospels. Z.V.I. Barries, on the other hand, believed that the Testimonium was subject to interpolation before Eusebius. Barries believes that Origen had seen the original Testimonium but that the Testimonium seen by Origen had no negative reference to Jesus, else Origen would have reacted against it. Barras states that the interpolation in the Testimonium took place between Origen and Eusebius. Paul Mayer states that a comparison of Eusebius's reference with the 10th century Arabic version of the Testimonium due to Agapius of Hierapolis indicates that the Christian interpolation present in the Testimonium must have come early, before Eusebius. Robert E. Van Voorst also states that the interpolation likely took place sometime between Origen and Eusebius.